December 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The cold was not just a condition, it was a weapon. It bit through the thickest wool, a relentless psychological enemy in the frozen labyrinth of the Western Front. At an altitude of a few hundred feet, the fog hung low, a dense, indifferent shroud over a landscape scarred by artillery and the ghosts of the dead. This was the Bulge, the brutal counter-offensive that had shattered the naive optimism of a quick end to the war. The promise of Christmas dinner in Berlin had curdled into a struggle for survival in the snow-choked forests. For Sergeant Thomas "Tommy" Rourke, a veteran of the 82nd Airborne, the days had become a monotonous cycle of patrols, frozen rations, and the ever-present thud of distant ordnance. His M1 Garand felt like an extension of his own numbed arm, a piece of industrial precision starkly contrasted against the primitive brutality of the battle. The objective was a routine sweep of a half-destroyed German supply route, a tangle of mud, ice, and shattered timber that the Allied strategists desperately needed to secure. Tommy led his small reconnaissance team through the skeletal remains of what was once a peaceful European woods. The air was sterile, broken only by the crunch of boots on frozen ground and the ragged breathing of the men. The irony of the situation was a cruel joke known only to the soldiers. While Allied air superiority reigned high above, down here, on the ground, the war was a mud and blood affair, a close-quarters knife fight that negated all the technological advances of the previous decade. The sophisticated radar and powerful engines of the Allied war machine meant nothing when a sniper's bullet could find its target from a few hundred yards in the fog. It was Corporal Mac McIntyre who spotted the discrepancy, a subtle sign that registered only with the hyper-vigilant eye of a soldier trained for anomaly. Not a bunker, but a shallow, camouflaged depression near a ridgeline, a hastily dug shelter. Not abandoned, but seemingly forgotten. The chilling reality was that they had stumbled upon an isolated pocket, a remnant of the initial German thrust, bypassed and left to the mercies of the relentless winter. Rourke approached the shelter with the practiced caution of a man who had seen too much. The scent was the first confirmation, the sharp metallic tang of stale blood and the distinct cloying smell of illness and untreated wounds. He raised his Garand, the heavy, reassuring weight of familiar comfort, and signaled his men to cover. What they expected was a few half-frozen German stragglers, desperate and armed. What they found defied every expectation, shattering the neat, tactical walls Tommy had built around his mind. Inside the makeshift dugout, huddled beneath a threadbare, blood-soaked blanket, was not a soldier, but a woman. She was barely conscious, her eyes wide and dark in a face drawn tight by starvation. Her uniform, what little could be discerned beneath the dirt and makeshift bandages, was unmistakably German army issue, but of a type Tommy had never encountered on the front lines. The rank, the insignia, it was all alien. This discovery was a complication the tactical manuals had never accounted for. Female soldiers were rare, but not unheard of, typically serving in non-combat roles. But this one was a prisoner, seemingly abandoned, and judging by her emaciated state, starving. A voice, the kind of inner voice honed by years of combat, screamed a warning. She is the enemy. She is a potential trap. Yet the sheer, undeniable vulnerability before him, the sight of a human being reduced to a shivering, desperate shell, overrode the strategic calculation. The enemy was supposed to be robust, zealous, the fanatic soldier of the Third Reich. This was just a victim of the war's indifference. Rourke lowered his rifle. "Easy," he murmured, his voice rough and unused to speaking softly after weeks of shouting over the sound of battle. The woman flinched, attempting a weak movement that failed to lift her from the frozen earth. Her eyes, however, held a spark of intelligence, a sharp, fearful awareness. What Rourke did not know, what the strategists poring over maps in safe command posts could not possibly foresee, was that this encounter, this small, seemingly insignificant act of defiance against the brutal logic of attrition, would not only save a life, but would unravel a thread of espionage, technological secrets, and personal betrayal that led directly back to the highest echelons of the German war machine. The starved prisoner was not a footnote in the Battle of the Bulge. She was a critical chapter that had, until this moment, remained unwritten. Rourke gave McIntyre a direct order, an implicit challenge to the military code. Get the medic and a warm canteen. She's not a threat, she's a casualty. The GI had faced tanks, artillery, and fanatical SS troops, but in the desolate quiet of that German dugout, he faced a new, more dangerous opponent. His own conscience. If this discovery has piqued your interest, and you want to follow the full dramatic arc of this GI and the secrets he uncovers, please consider hitting the subscribe button and turning on notifications. This is only the beginning of a story that redefines the true cost of war. The immediate problem facing Sergeant Rourke was not military, but logistical and moral. Moving a severely malnourished, possibly wounded German prisoner through active combat zones was a near impossible task. Military regulations were clear. Prisoners were to be processed, their information extracted, and their welfare, while mandated by the Geneva Convention, often took a back seat to tactical expediency. A woman prisoner, especially one found in such an isolated, desperate state, was an anomaly that threatened to disrupt the precise machinery of war. Rourke's medic, a young man from Brooklyn named Doc Schneider, worked swiftly under the flickering light of a field lantern. His initial assessment was grim. Severe hypothermia, advanced malnutrition, and signs of untreated wounds that suggested she had been in that shelter for days, perhaps a week, completely alone. She needs fluid, warmth, and about 3,000 calories, Sergeant, Schneider muttered, his voice echoing the professional detachment that masked the shock of the discovery. She's a whisper away from going under. The woman, they learned her name, whispered weakly, was Elsa, was bundled into a makeshift stretcher and carefully transported back to the rear echelon field dressing station, an act that took 3 agonizing hours through the frozen underbrush. At the station, Rourke had to justify his actions to his commanding officer, Captain Heller, a man driven by statistics and the relentless pressure of holding the line. "Rourke, what in God's name is this?" Heller demanded, pointing at the fragile figure resting on a cot. "A souvenir? We're losing men to frostbite and Kraut counterattacks, and you bring in a stray female POW?" Rourke stood firm, the rigid discipline of the airborne holding him steady. "Sir, she was a casualty. Abandoned. She was wearing a uniform, but she's not a line soldier. More importantly, Captain, the uniform is unusual, not the Wehrmacht standard. The insignia, sir, I can't place it." This was Rourke's first pivot, shifting the focus from the human drama to the strategic curiosity. The captain, a creature of military intelligence, immediately narrowed his eyes. The uniform was a dark gray, finer weave than standard infantry, with subtle, highly stylized patches depicting a complex, almost scientific-looking crest. A short time later, Major Caldwell, an intelligence officer, arrived. Caldwell was the embodiment of the war's technological shift, a man who valued ciphers over courage, and whose primary weapon was knowledge. He surveyed Elsa with a cold, assessing gaze. "Her papers, Rourke?" Caldwell asked, his voice clipped. Rourke produced the small, water-damaged Soldatenbuch, soldier's book, found clutched in her hand. Caldwell flipped through the pages. The photos were startling. A young woman with sharp, intelligent features, dressed not in a fighting uniform, but a technical one, surrounded by complex machinery. Caldwell paused at the official assignment stamp. He read the entry, his face an unreadable mask, before looking up at Rourke. "This woman, Elsa Schmidt. She's listed as a technical auxiliary for the Forschungsstelle für Funkmessgeräte, the research center for radio measuring devices." He paused, letting the implication hang in the tense air. "In layman's terms, Sergeant, she was a radar technician, high level, and not just any radar. She was attached to the unit responsible for the refinement of the Würzburg-Riese and the development of airborne intercept radar, the very systems that have been making life hell for our bomber boys over the Reich." The tactical irony was immediate and profound. Rourke hadn't saved a random casualty. He had potentially rescued a crucial component of the enemy's most sophisticated defensive technology. The stakes had just escalated from a humanitarian issue to a critical intelligence operation. Caldwell's tone hardened. "Her capture is extraordinary. Her knowledge could be priceless, but she was abandoned. Why? The Germans don't leave valuable assets to starve in the snow. They protect them. This suggests a betrayal, an execution attempt, or perhaps she was a defector who failed. Rourke's initial act of mercy was now tangled in a web of espionage. The starving woman was not just a symbol of suffering. She was a treasure trove of technical secrets. The Würzburg radar, with its massive parabolic dish, was the heart of the German night fighter defense, a technological shield that had cost the lives of thousands of Allied airmen. If Elsa possessed intimate knowledge of its operational limits, its vulnerability to electronic jamming, the Allied effort, specifically Operation Glimmer and Corona, could be refined, saving entire bomber formations. Caldwell turned to Rourke. "Sergeant, you found her. You brought her in. You will be her primary guard. She is not to speak to anyone without my express permission. And more importantly, you will find out what she knows. But we have a serious problem. She speaks almost no English, and none of us speak technical German." The challenge was clear. Rourke, a paratrooper, was now tasked with an intelligence operation requiring linguistic and technical nuance he did not possess. The fate of future Allied air raids, the staggering industrial output of Boeing B-17s and Avro Lancasters, could hinge on the broken German of a young, starving woman found in a frozen hole. Rourke had saved her life, but now he had to extract the reason for her life being saved. The game had changed from a ground fight in the mud to a silent, psychological duel over the very blueprint of the German defense grid. Elsa's physical recovery was slow, measured in spoonfuls of broth and ounces of plasma. As her strength gradually returned, so did her fear, a constant, wide-eyed vigilance that suggested she feared her own people more than her captors. Rourke, constrained by Caldwell's strict orders, was her constant shadow, an armed guard forced into the role of reluctant caretaker. The linguistic barrier was a fortress. Their communication was reduced to simple gestures: water, food, warmth. But Rourke, observing her, began to notice details that reinforced Caldwell's assessment. When she thought she was unobserved, she would move her fingers in precise, complex patterns, as if manipulating invisible dials or tracing schematics on a phantom panel. The restless memory of a mind intimately familiar with complex machinery. The breakthrough came via a captured German engineering officer, a man brought in to translate. The officer, initially defiant, was offered specific comforts in exchange for cooperation.
Rourke brought the translator, Lieutenant Klaus Richter, a tall, gaunt man with a precise demeanor, to Elsa's bedside. The conversation began tentatively, a brittle exchange in a foreign tongue. Richter translated the initial questions: identity, unit, circumstances of capture. Elsa's replies were hesitant, evasive. She claimed she was part of a forward team caught by the initial Allied advance, abandoned when their truck broke down. A simple, predictable cover story.
Then, Richter shifted the line of questioning, guided by Caldwell's specific technical instructions. "He asks about the Knickebein system," Richter translated, his voice low. Knickebein, or crooked leg, was the radio navigation beam used by the Luftwaffe to guide their bombers. Elsa's composure fractured. Her eyes flashed with sudden, genuine fear, not of the Allied soldiers, but of the name itself. "The Knickebein is obsolete," she whispered, her voice still weak but carrying a sharp technical authority. "It was cracked years ago. Our real focus was on the Fuji-220 Liechtenstein SN2. Richter translated, and Rourke felt the hairs on his neck rise. Liechtenstein SN2, the airborne radar system that had dramatically turned the tide against the British bomber stream in 1943. It was a technical marvel that allowed German night fighters to operate blind, hunting their prey with terrifying efficiency. Caldwell, listening from behind a curtain, stepped forward, dismissing Richter and addressing Elsa directly in passable, if heavily accented, German. "The SN2, its dipole antenna array creates too much drag. Its frequency is too easily jammed by window, chaff. What replaced it? The Neptune, the Naxos." Elsa hesitated, a conflict visible in her eyes. The soldier in her, drilled to protect national secrets, warred with the desperate, starved woman Rourke had saved. Naxos, she finally admitted, her voice barely a breath. Naxos is passive, a high-frequency homing device, but the future, the project I was transferred to. It was the POW 240 a centimetric radar. It was meant to be invisible to your window. This was the intelligence motherlode. Centimetric radar was the critical next step, a technology the Allies had been scrambling to deploy, and one the Germans were thought to be years away from perfecting. If true, the POW 240 Berlin meant the Luftwaffe was poised to regain the technological edge in the air war, potentially devastating the pending Allied spring offensive. Caldwell looked at Rourke, a grim satisfaction in his eyes. This changes everything, Sergeant. The intelligence she's providing suggests her unit was developing something the Führer would consider a wonder weapon. Why was she left to die? Rourke, remembering the fear in her eyes when she spoke of her own side, pressed his theory. Major, she wasn't abandoned. She was silenced. Look at her wounds, sir. Not from shrapnel. They're old, deliberate. She was running or being hunted. He knelt beside her cot, his M1 Garand resting on the floor. He spoke slowly, carefully, using the few German words he knew and letting his expression convey the sincerity he couldn't put into language. You helped us. Now, we help you. Tell me who did this to you. The men who left you. Elsa swallowed hard, her hand instinctively touching a barely visible scar beneath her ear. The Gestapo, she whispered, the German word heavy with pure terror. Not the military. They accused me of sabotage, of losing the frequency code for the Berlin set during a transport. A lie. It was a pretext. She paused, gathering strength for the confession that explained her abandonment, her starvation, and the secret behind her capture. They needed a scapegoat. The frequency zeroing code. It wasn't lost. It was given. I met a man in Frankfurt, an engineer. He told me the truth about what the POW 240 would do, how many children would die under the bombs. He was working for the wider stand, resistance. He took the code. I was meant to follow him, to escape, but they caught the transport before I could get away. They assumed I was the traitor, but they kept me alive for a week, trying to find out who my contact was. They tortured me. They brought me here to be executed under the guise of an enemy attack. The profound irony was staggering. Rourke had saved a German scientist, not an enemy fanatic, but a technical auxiliary, who had, in her own way, committed an act of treason against her regime to save Allied lives. She was not a prisoner of war. She was a survivor of a German execution attempt, a witness to a high-level act of technological sabotage by the German resistance. The starving woman was a key, not just to a radar frequency, but to the existence of a highly organized, dangerous network of German scientists and engineers actively working to undermine the Nazi war machine from within. With the revelation of Elsa's involvement with the German resistance, Widerstand, the situation transformed from a simple intelligence capture into a deep-cover extraction mission. Major Caldwell understood the magnitude of the information. The existence of the POW 240 Berlin was one threat. The existence of a technical resistance network was a game-changer that could shorten the war by months. Elsa, however, was terrified. Her confession had bought her safety within the American lines, but it also painted a target on her back. She insisted that the Gestapo agent who had overseen her transport and execution attempt, a man named Hauptsturmführer Kessel, was still in the area, tasked with ensuring her demise and, crucially, tracking down the engineer who possessed the true frequency zeroing code. Kessel will not believe I am dead until he sees proof, Elsa stated, translated by a now fully invested Lieutenant Richter. He is meticulous, a hunter. He knows I am the only one who can identify the engineer, Hans Richter. No relation to the lieutenant, I hope. The irony was not lost on Rourke. The hunter had become the hunted, and the protector was the soldier who had originally intended to kill her. Rourke and Caldwell had to act fast. They needed to move Elsa out of the combat zone to the relative safety of an intelligence hub in Paris or London, but Kessel was a variable they couldn't ignore. Caldwell secured a transport plane for the transfer. The challenge? moving her through the chaos of the forward airfields without attracting undue attention. The solution was a deception. Elsa was disguised as an American nurse, ostensibly being evacuated for severe battle fatigue, a common casualty type in the bulge. Rourke was assigned as her sole guard, tasked with maintaining the ruse and ensuring Kessel, if he was indeed operating nearby, did not intercept them. The journey to the forward airfield was tense, a silent, nerve-wracking ride in the back of a canvas-covered jeep. The mud was a constant, sucking enemy, slowing their progress. It was Rourke's paratrooper training, the absolute necessity of assessing a scene for threats and anomalies, that saved them. As they approached the dimly lit, snow-swept perimeter of the airfield, he noticed a vehicle parked oddly off the road, a civilian Opel sedan painted in a muddy gray, incongruous with the massive military trucks and tanks churning past. "Stop the jeep," Rourke ordered the driver, his voice low. "Engine trouble. Wait 5 minutes." Rourke walked back toward the Opel, his M1 Garand held close. Through a gap in the canvas cover, Elsa's eyes were wide with panic. "Kessel," she mouthed, her voice a dry, rasping whisper. "That car. It's his." Rourke acted on instinct. He knew that engaging Kessel in a firefight at the perimeter would draw unwanted attention, jeopardize the transport, and risk Elsa. He needed to confirm his target and neutralize the threat silently. He circled the Opel, noting the frosted windows and the faint scent of expensive, imported cigarette smoke, a detail out of place on the front lines. He pulled the bolt back on his Garand, chambering around with a distinct metallic click. Before he could reach the driver's side, the door of the Opel swung open. Kessel emerged, a tall, impeccably dressed man in a black SS uniform coat, holding a silenced Luger PO8. He was not a soldier of the line, but an operative, his precision and calculated movements betraying his Gestapo training. Kessel hadn't been watching the road. He had been listening to military radio chatter, perhaps having intercepted a vague, coded message about a high-value asset being moved. "Sergeant," Kessel said, his English flawless, his tone dangerously polite. "A small matter of property exchange. The prisoner you are transporting, Elsa Schmidt. She belongs to the Reich." The irony was devastating. Rourke was an American soldier, facing a German SS officer. But they were not fighting over territory or tactical advantage. They were fighting over the life of a German technological genius who had betrayed her own country. The war had dissolved into a personal duel of ideology and espionage. Rourke knew he couldn't use his rifle. The sound would bring the base security screaming down on them, turning a surgical strike into a messy disaster. He dropped the Garand and lunged, relying on the close-quarters combat training of the airborne. The fight was a brutal, silent ballet in the snow. Kessel was fast, trained to kill with surgical efficiency. He slashed the Luger at Rourke's head. Rourke ducked, absorbing the glancing blow, and drove his shoulder into Kessel's midsection. They crashed into the frozen embankment. The Luger skittered away into the snow. Rourke, fueled by the adrenaline and the memory of Elsa's starving face, fought with the primal fury of a protector. Kessel fought with the cold scientific efficiency of an executioner. The Gestapo agent reached for a small leather-bound folder tucked inside his coat. "You have no idea, Yankee," Kessel grunted, his face contorted in a sneer. "The depth of her betrayal. She signed the death warrant of millions of civilians with that code." Rourke, ignoring the provocation, slammed his fist into Kessel's jaw. The German operative went down, his head cracking hard against the frozen ground. As Rourke retrieved the silenced Luger, he noticed the leather folder that had fallen from Kessel's coat. He picked it up. It contained photographs and detailed German intelligence reports on Allied electronic countermeasures, Operation Mandrel, Shaft, and crucially, a complete analysis of the British H-2S radar system. But tucked inside was a small, sealed envelope marked, chillingly, Acti K Case K. Rourke had neutralized the immediate threat, but the brief, savage encounter had confirmed Elsa's story and left him with a physical piece of the German intelligence machine, a key to understanding the full, terrifying scope of the technological war being waged in the shadows. Back in the relative safety of the airbase command tent, Major Caldwell was examining the contents of Acti K, Case K. The folder was a Gestapo file detailing Elsa Schmidt's surveillance, tracing her movements, her communications, and, most importantly, the systematic dismantling of the German resistance cell she had been working with in Frankfurt. The documents confirmed Elsa's account. The technical engineer, Hans Richter, had indeed stolen the frequency zeroing code for the FUG-240 Berlin centimetric radar. But Akte K revealed a crucial, terrifying layer of complexity. The code was not merely a frequency, it was part of a dynamic cipher system. The Germans were paranoid, Caldwell explained, pointing to a complex technical diagram in the file. The Berlin radar uses a frequency hopping system. The zeroing code isn't static, it's a seed for an algorithm. Without that seed, you can't predict the pattern of the hop. Our electronic countermeasures, our window, will be useless after the Germans activate the full FUG-240 network. The technical implications were disastrous. If the Luftwaffe deployed the Berlin radar as intended, the entire Allied strategic bombing campaign, the massive, industry-crippling raids over cities like Hamburg and Berlin, would face a renewed, invisible, and virtually unstoppable air defense. The casualty rates of the bloody 100th would look like a minor skirmish. The irony was now twofold. Elsa's act of treason against her country was the only thing preventing a tactical catastrophe for the Allies. And Kessel, the SS operative, wasn't just tracking Elsa. He was tracking the seed code, the intelligence that could either save thousands of Allied lives or doom them. Elsa, recovering quickly now that the immediate threat had been addressed, spoke to Rourke and Caldwell with the clarity of a scientist explaining a complex theorem. "The code is not written down," she stated firmly. "Hans, the engineer, memorized it. It is too complex to transfer. But the Gestapo knows who he is, and Kessel was trying to use me as bait to find him. Hans is hiding in the Rheinmetall factory complex near Kassel. He knows the place is targeted for bombing, but he is waiting for a signal." Her face grew drawn. "The truth, Major Caldwell, is that I am the only person Hans trusts. I am the only one who can identify the real signal he is looking for, a specific pattern in the Allied jamming of German radio frequencies, a signal only a radar specialist would recognize. This was the strategic high-stakes gamble. The Allied command needed Hans Richter and that code, but to get him, they had to send Elsa, their most valuable human intelligence asset, back into German-held territory, into the very factory that Kessel and his network of SS operatives were undoubtedly watching. Caldwell looked at Rourke. "Sergeant, you have an intimate understanding of her situation, and you've proven you can handle the Gestapo. You're the only man I trust to see this through. We're going to use this Akte K file against Kessel. We'll arrange a specialized insertion behind enemy lines, a tactical parachute drop near the factory complex." The plan was audacious, bordering on insane. A two-person insertion into the heart of the Reich, masquerading as a captured German officer transporting a prisoner. Elsa, despite her fear, insisted on going. "It is my debt," she stated simply. "I gave the resistance the means to save lives. I must ensure the mission is finished. Otherwise, my sacrifice and the deaths of my friends in the resistance mean nothing." Rourke, the paratrooper who had originally signed up to shoot the enemy, was now preparing to infiltrate the enemy lines, relying on the technical expertise of a German spy and the audacity of a plan hatched from a Gestapo file. The war had stopped being about territory. It was about protecting a secret code and the life of the person who possessed it. The industrial might of the Allied Air Force, the technological marvel of centimetric radar, and the fate of the strategic bombing campaign now rested on two figures, an American GI and a German scientist, about to jump into the night sky over Kassel. January 1945. Sky over Kassel, Germany. The transition from the relative warmth of the transport plane to the freezing rush of the German night sky was a violent physical shock. Rourke, dressed in a captured, customized German paratrooper uniform, his face blackened with soot, felt the familiar surge of adrenaline. Beside him, Elsa, now wearing a slightly oversized German auxiliary uniform, held onto her harness with a white-knuckled grip, her expression a mixture of terror and fierce resolve. The jump was executed flawlessly. They landed softly in a snow-covered field several miles from the industrial sprawl of the Rheinmetall factory, a sprawling complex that produced everything from tank engines to specialized radar components, and a major target for Allied bombers. Their cover was simple and brutally dangerous. Rourke, disguised as a German officer, Major Klaus Schmidt, a fabricated identity created by Caldwell's team, was escorting Elsa, a high-value prisoner defector, back to the factory for a final interrogation by the SS before her presumed execution. The Acte K file, heavily edited, served as Rourke's necessary documentation. The true challenge was the relentless, psychological stress of operating behind enemy lines, surrounded by German patrols, civilian vigilance, and the omnipresent threat of being discovered as an American. Every accent, every glance, every moment of hesitation was a potential death sentence. They moved toward the factory under the cover of the pre-dawn gloom. Elsa, despite her physical weakness, proved to be an invaluable asset. She knew the territory, the patrol patterns, and the rigid discipline that characterized German military movements, a discipline that could be exploited. "The guards change at 0400, she whispered to Rourke as they crouched beside a railway line. "They will be exhausted, but hyper-vigilant because of the cold. We must approach through the maintenance tunnels. They are old, rarely used, but they bypass the main checkpoints." The irony was palpable. Rourke, the seasoned American paratrooper, was following the operational plan of a German radar technician. The conventional enemy lines had been utterly blurred as they navigated the labyrinthine, steam-filled maintenance tunnels beneath the factory complex. Rourke took a moment to express the central paradox of their mission. "Why, Elsa?" he whispered, his German rough. "Why risk everything for a code? You could have stayed safe with us. You saw what Kessel is capable of." Elsa paused, her face illuminated by the weak beam of their flashlight, dust motes dancing in the light. "I am a scientist, Sergeant. I understand scale. My father was killed in Hamburg, not by your bombs, but by the war he helped build. The Fuji 240 is a machine designed to enable mass murder on a larger scale. It is a symbol of my country's technological brilliance twisted into a tool of fanaticism." She looked at him, her eyes steady. "Hans and I, we did not join the resistance for the Allies. We joined the resistance for Germany, to stop the insane final act of the Führer. This code is the only way to stop that technology from being deployed. It is not an American code. It is a human code." Her words were a profound vindication of Rourke's initial decision to save her. He had not saved a spy. He had saved a reluctant idealist, driven by a higher moral calculus than military allegiance. They finally located the designated meeting point, a sub-level electrical relay station deep within the factory, a place where the noise of machinery would mask their presence, and where Hans Richter, the engineer, would feel safe enough to wait. Elsa initiated the identification sequence, a sequence based not on words, but on a prearranged radio signal. Rourke switched on a small, customized radio transmitter provided by Caldwell. It began broadcasting a complex, almost random pattern of static and tones on a frequency used by German communication lines, a specific pattern designed to mimic the signature of Allied jamming. Elsa listened intently, her face drawn. "Hans will be listening for this," she whispered. "It mimics the signature of our frequency hopping system being successfully cracked. It is the signal. The plan is safe. They know the secrets." After 10 agonizing minutes, a shadow moved in the corner of the relay station. A man emerged, thin, pale, with the tired, haunted eyes of a man living under relentless pressure. This was Hans Richter, the engineer who held the fate of the Allied air war in his memory. Hans looked at Rourke, the imposing figure in the German officer's uniform, and then to Elsa. He was confused, suspicious. "Elsa?" Hans asked, his voice cracking. "They said you were..." "Executed," Elsa finished for him. She stepped toward him, then stopped, holding her hands out. "The final, ultimate test." "Hans," she said clearly, "what is the inverse ratio of the Doppler shift equation in the Mark III prototype?" It was a test only 2 engineers who had worked intimately on the Berlin project could pass. Hans's face cleared. Relief, profound and total, washed over him. The truth was confirmed, and the handshake of trust, a technical cipher, had been exchanged. Rourke stepped forward, his heart pounding not from fear, but from the immense weight of the moment. The American GI now stood face to face with the German engineer who possessed the key, the frequency zeroing code, that could cripple the Nazis' most advanced technological weapon and save thousands of lives. Their extraction had to be immediate, surgical, and silent, for the SS operative Kessel was undoubtedly closing in. The retrieval of the zeroing code was not a physical act, but an intellectual one. Hans Richter could not write it down. The complexity of the dynamic cipher was too great for quick transcription, and the risk of the code falling into the wrong hands was too high. He had to be extracted alive. Rourke quickly communicated the situation to Caldwell via a short-burst radio transmission. Target acquired. Exfiltration in progress. Priority 1. The escape route was through the factory's labyrinthine steam tunnels, the same route they had used for infiltration. However, their movements were no longer silent. The sheer audacity of a suspected defector and her contact being inside the secure factory complex had triggered an alarm, not a general military one, but a subtle, focused alert intended only for the Gestapo and SS security units. As they moved through a darkened pump room, the familiar scent of expensive cigarettes and the measured, cold sound of boots on concrete brought the fear rushing back. Hauptsturmführer Kessel was waiting. He hadn't been watching the perimeter. He had anticipated their infiltration route based on his knowledge of Elsa's preferences and the Resistance's known points of refuge within the factory. He was a strategic thinker, a master of deduction. Kessel emerged from the shadows, flanked by 2 armed SS security men, all 3 holding their weapons steady. "Elsa Schmidt, Hans Richter," Kessel said, his voice echoing in the concrete space, dripping with calculated disappointment. "A pathetic final chapter. I knew you would come back to secure your legacy, Elsa. The Fuji 240 is the future. Your sentimental treason is a tragic flaw." He focused his attention on Rourke, the man in the badly tailored German officer's uniform. "And you, Major Schmidt, your German is terrible, your uniform is ill-fitting, and your face is too honest for the SS. You are the American paratrooper who defied orders in the Ardennes, Sergeant Thomas Rourke." The final confrontation was a psychological war of nerves. Rourke knew the SS men would not hesitate. He had only one card to play: the truth. "Kessel," Rourke stated, his English clear and deliberately loud, a sound alien in the German factory. "The war is over for you. Your technology is compromised. Hans Richter has already transferred the zeroing code to Allied command." A flicker of genuine panic crossed Kessel's eyes, the fear of a zealot realizing his grand, technological future was crumbling. "Lies!" Kessel roared, but the doubt was there. "The code is too complex for radio transfer. It must be transcribed." This was the opening Rourke needed. He signaled Elsa, who had been holding a small, battery-powered radio part, a key component of the Berlin radar. She had scavenged on her way to the meeting point. Elsa, driven by the courage of conviction, stepped forward. "Kessel, I gave them the key to the dynamic cipher. The entire FUG 240 system is now a liability. We have turned your wonder weapon into a liability for the Reich." The technological paradox was the ultimate weapon. Kessel knew that if the Allies had even a fraction of the zeroing code, the system could be turned against them. His moment of doubt was Rourke's window. Rourke used the distraction to throw his heavy M1 Garand directly at the 2 SS security guards, creating a deafening clatter and a moment of tactical chaos. As the SS men reacted, Rourke tackled Kessel, driving him against a large metallic pipe, knocking the Luger from his hand. The fight was short, desperate, and vicious. Rourke, fueled by the memory of the frozen forest and the thousands of airmen that code could save, fought with blunt, overwhelming force. He subdued Kessel, snapping his handcuffs onto the SS officer's wrists. Meanwhile, Hans and Elsa, true to their engineering nature, had not been idle. They had sabotaged the pump room's main power conduit, plunging the area into complete darkness. Under the cover of the blackness, Rourke, Elsa, and Hans made their escape. They left Kessel handcuffed and raging, a symbolic victory over the man who represented the technological fanaticism of the Reich. Their final exfiltration was messy, but successful. They rendezvoused with a small Allied advance reconnaissance unit that Rourke had coordinated with Caldwell via the short-burst transmission. As they were sped away in an armored vehicle, the sound of the air raid sirens began to blare across the factory complex. Looking back, Rourke saw the searchlights pierce the night sky, their beams converging on the factory, a prelude to the impending Allied bombing raid. The irony of the mission was complete. The very system Elsa and Hans had helped to build was now about to be destroyed, with the blessing of their intelligence. The zeroing code was safe. The technological edge had been secured. But the human cost of this victory, the moral complexity of choosing allegiance and survival, was only just beginning to be counted. Spring 1945. Intelligence Command Post, London. The zeroing code, transferred by Hans Richter's testimony, proved to be exactly as Elsa had described, the key to defeating the Fuji-240 Berlin radar. Within weeks, the Allies deployed new electronic countermeasures that rendered the German centimetric radar virtually useless. The strategic bombing campaign, now flying with unprecedented impunity, accelerated the destruction of Germany's industrial heartland, undeniably shortening the war. Sergeant Thomas Rourke, the paratrooper who had defied a direct order to save a starving enemy, was quietly decorated for his role in the intelligence coup. His citation, however, was carefully worded to omit any mention of Elsa Schmidt's identity or the resistance. The official record noted only the retrieval of critical high-level technological intelligence from behind enemy lines. Elsa Schmidt and Hans Richter were kept in the utmost secrecy for the remainder of the war. They were not treated as prisoners, but as invaluable technical consultants. Their knowledge of German industry and scientific infrastructure proved instrumental in the final months of the conflict and in the subsequent post-war efforts, the race for German scientists known as Operation Paperclip. The final irony of their story lies in the profound shift of loyalty. Elsa, the German scientist, became a key advisor on Allied technological development. Rourke, the American GI, had his understanding of the enemy irrevocably altered. He had saved a life, and in doing so, had realized that the war was not fought in the stark, black-and-white terms of propaganda, but in the moral gray of individual choice. Decades later, in interviews with surviving members of the intelligence community, the story of Case Zero would surface only in whispers, the unlikely alliance forged in the snow of the Ardennes. Elsa, who eventually emigrated to the United States and dedicated her life to non-military scientific research, once wrote a letter to Rourke decades after the war. A line from that letter summarizes the true human legacy of the mission. The German soldier was trained to follow the rules of the state. The American soldier was trained to follow the rules of war. But you, Thomas, you followed a third rule, the one that is never written down in any manual, German or American, the rule of mercy. Their story is a powerful testament to the fact that while technology and strategy drive the mechanics of war, it is the individual human conscience that often dictates its moral outcome. Rourke's simple act of compassion in that frozen hole did more than save one life. It secured a strategic victory and affirmed the existence of integrity and courage even in the darkest corners of the conflict. The zeroing code was the tactical key, but Rourke's decision to see a starving human being instead of an enemy insignia was the moral key that unlocked the path to peace. The frozen labyrinth of the Ardennes gave way to the technological future. The fear Kessel sought to instill was ultimately defeated not by a superior tank or bomber, but by the quiet act of a soldier offering a warm canteen to his supposed enemy. Thank you for following this deep dive into the hidden technological and human drama of the Western Front. If you appreciate the detail, historical accuracy, and high-quality narrative structure of this story, please show your support by subscribing to our channel and giving this video a like. Your engagement allows us to continue bringing these complex, untold stories of the Second World War to light.